Good morning students, I welcome you all for the online class of economics. Today we will be continuing with the topic that is the deficits, what the government is getting. As we have started the government budget chapter, today I will be going to explain you how the way government budget is made, how the way the deficit faced by deficit, what do you mean by deficit today, which I will be going to explain main thing. As the government has planned something, the budget what they had planned, according to the budget they are not getting the income so that they can make an expenditure, that is known as deficit. As per the planning, when the expenditure is more according to the as compared to revenue or the income which government have to earn, it is known as deficit made by the government. So today these formulas before you, what is there, revenue deficit, fiscal deficit and primary deficit, what the government are getting, and because of that they are not able to achieve the target what they have set, it is known as deficit. Let us have the distinguish between the revenue budget and capital budget first of all. That part of the government budget which shows revenue account including revenue receipt and capital revenue expenditure is known as revenue budget. That part of the government budget which shows capital account including capital receipt and capital expenditure is known as capital budget. So let us have the particular thing. Very first which we will be going to understand is budget deficit. What do you mean by budget deficit, students? It is the deficit which a government is facing when your expenditure, though it is of the capital or revenue nature, it is more than the income which is though it is revenue receipts or the capital receipts, it is less than the revenue receipts and capital receipt, what the expenditure, it is known as deficit, and that deficit is known as budget deficit. Okay, so budget deficit, also called government deficit, refers to a situation when budget expenditure of the government are greater than budget receipts of the government. With reference to the budget of the government of India, there are three important types of budget deficit. These are revenue deficit, fiscal deficit and primary deficit. When we will take this particular part, revenue deficit. What do you mean by revenue deficit? Revenue deficit is related to revenue expenditure and revenue receipts of the government. This does not include items of capital receipts and capital expenditure. Thus, revenue deficit is excess of revenue expenditure over the revenue receipts. Revenue deficit equals to revenue earning, revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts, where revenue expenditure is greater than revenue receipts, RR. RE is revenue expenditure, RR is the revenue receipts. May I think the points is clear to you people. The budget deficit are of three types. One is revenue deficit, one is fiscal deficit and primary deficit. When we say about the revenue deficit, it is related to revenue expenditure and revenue receipts of the government. This does not include items of capital receipts and capital expenditure. Thus, revenue deficit is excess of revenue expenditure over revenue receipts. Revenue deficit equals to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts when revenue expenditure greater than revenue receipts. Implications. What is the implications? What is the result of this particular thing when the revenue expenditure greater than the revenue receipt? What things happens? What is the impact on the government? Let us see that. What do you do when your annual expenditure exceeds your annual income? You have to choose among the following options. What the options are there? Very first, plan the cut in expenditure. Very first thing, what we can do whenever income is not more as compared to our expenditure, then definitely our expenditure has to be reduced. Raise fund through borrowings. Second thing is that if still you want to manage the expenditure, though your income is not more than the expenditure, borrow the money from market. That is the second thing, what we usually do. And the third is raise funds by selling your assets, house, etc. So the third thing what you can do, you can sell off your assets so as to get your money, so as to do the expenditure. The government is also placed in a similar situation. These three things what we do in our normal life. For some of the people say we will not do expenditure as we are not having money. Some people say we will borrow money from some people and we will do the expenditure and later we will return back the money of the person. And some people say we will sell off the assets to get the next asset of the new asset what we want to get. Same way government also do. Government exercise three options. Very first, the government cuts its expenditure even when it's at the cost of welfare of the people. But though it is for the welfare of the people, but if the government revenue is not that much, definitely government will reduce its expenditure. Example, the government in India has cut its expenditure on subsidies by restricting the supply of subsidized LPG cylinders to 9 per family during an year. This might cause hardships, people with low income. Second, the government resort to borrowings from the general public, from the RBI, from the rest of the world. So they can borrow the money from these people, either from the Reserve Bank of India, either from rest of the world, or either from the government resort. The third, the option government, what they can do, they undertake disinvestment, selling its ownership of public enterprise, thus causes a reduction in its asset. So these they can do. There are two ways of lowering revenue deficit. One is borrowing from the general public, RBI or rest of the world. Second, disinvestment by way of selling its ownership, the shares of public enterprises. These can be done. So two ways of lowering the revenue deficit is, very first, borrowing from the general public can be done, RBI or rest of the world. Second, disinvestment by way of selling its ownership can be done. So these are the ways how the revenue deficit can be fulfilled. Fiscal deficit. So I had explained what is the revenue deficit and how the way government try to fulfill the revenue deficit what they are incurring. Fiscal deficit. What is a fiscal deficit, student? As government are deciding the earnings, the revenues according to the tax what they will be collecting from the people, and that tax we have studied there are in two forms. One is tax receive and one is non-tax receive. Government are getting that only in the form of revenue. Okay, so that revenue only they will be utilizing for the welfare of the society, and that will make the expenditure of the government. So fiscal deficit, what it is? The deficit which the government is getting is estimated according for both the revenue as well as capital receipts and expenditure of the government. That is, fiscal deficit is the excess of total expenditure, revenue plus capital nature over total receipts, revenue plus capital other than borrowings. Okay, here borrowings will not come. Revenue plus capital other than borrowings. It is estimated as under fiscal deficit equals to total expenditure, revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure minus total receipts other than borrowings, revenue receipt plus capital receipt other than borrowings. That is known as fiscal deficit. So the short formula is FD equals to TE, or you can say BE. That is a budgeted expenditure minus budgeted receipts other than borrowings when B is greater than BR. That is, budgeted expenditure is greater than budgeted revenue. Here we are counting capital plus revenue, both the things in receipt as well as in expenditure. That will be considered as total budgeted expenditure, and revenue, when we say it is revenue plus capital receipts what we are getting, it is known as budgeted revenue. When budgeted revenue is less than budgeted expenditure, what we come fiscal deficit. Okay, so let us see how the implication will be there of the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit estimated as the difference between the total expenditure and total receipts other than borrowings. Yeah, borrowings we will not see. Is often treated as gross fiscal deficit. As there are three sources of borrowing for the government, gross fiscal deficit is also estimated as under. Gross fiscal deficit equals to borrowing from RBI plus borrowing from abroad plus net borrowings at home, means from home country what we are borrowing. That is known as gross fiscal deficit. Once again I want to say the formula. Gross fiscal deficit equals to borrowing from RBI plus borrowing from abroad plus net borrowings at home country. That is known as gross fiscal deficit. Gross fiscal deficit shows estimated borrowing by the government to cope with its expenditure during the year. Given often it is expressed as a percentage of gross domestic product. This is estimated as excess of government expenditure over government receipts other than borrowings during the year. In terms of sources of borrowing, it is maybe estimated as borrowing from Reserve Bank of India plus borrowings from abroad plus net borrowings at home. You remember this formula for gross fiscal deficit. Implications, what the reserve will be there, what the government will be doing for shortcomings of this Net borrowings. Fiscal deficit is an estimate of borrowings by the government. Greater fiscal deficit implies greater borrowings by the government. Implications of fiscal deficit are as under: inflationary spiral. Borrowings from Reserve Bank of India is an important component of government borrowings. This increases money supply in the economy. Increase in money supply leads to increase in the general price level. A persistent increase in the general price level over a period of time leads to inflationary spiral. What is inflationary spiral? As compared to income of the people, when the prices of the goods also increases, it is known as inflation. This situation will not control, because as income of the people increases, the demand of the goods increases unnecessary, where they will demand many of the things, and because when the demand increases, the parallelly before the income increases of the people, prices of the goods also increases, prices of the services increases. To bear this, what will be happening there? Unnecessary the prices will be creating the inflation situation. Many of the people will be deprived because their income is not increasing, but prices increases because of other people's income increases. As government is going to whenever declare seventh pay, sixth pay, fifth pay, likewise they started. When this pay has not been declared, when it has been not incremented in the salary of the people, from that time only the prices of the goods start increasing. So that time what situation arises? Inflation. So inflationary spiral will increase. Definitely. Borrowing from RBI is an important component of government borrowings. This increases money supply in the economy. Increase in the money supply leads to increase in the general price level. A persistent increase in the general price level over a period of time leads to inflationary spiral. It is like wage price spiral. Wages catches prices and prices catch wages, as I already said. This hinders the process of growth as it raises the cost of raw material, the cost of credit for investment, the rate of interest, and the cost of labor increases unnecessarily. Mounting debt for future generation. Recurring borrowings mounts up national debt for future generations. Future generation inherit a laggard economy where GDP growth remains persistently low. This is because the repayment of loans consume the bulk of surplus year after year, and domestic investment continues to be low. So that is known as mounting debt for future generation. Recurring borrowings, what it does, it unnecessarily mount up the national debt for future generation. Future generation, what they do, they inherit a laggard economy. What laggard economy? They will not be having a security in their future, where GDP growth remains persistently low, the income of the people low, but prices will be increasing unnecessarily. This is because the repayment of loan consumes the bulk of surplus year after year, and domestic investment continues to be low. Definitely, student, as compared to the income, if we will be expending more, what the situation will be there? If we will be taking loan, definitely the future income of our country, what we will be doing? The future income of our salary, what we will be doing? It will be going in the debt payment only. It will be going in the payment of the loan and the rate of interest after that loan. So that way our salary will never be in the future will be incremented. It will be going in paying of the debts. So that way the situation will arise when there is a fiscal deficit. High vicious circle of high fiscal deficit and low GDP growth. Persistently high fiscal deficit leads to a situation where GDP growth remains low because of high fiscal deficit, and fiscal deficit remains high because of low GDP growth. High fiscal deficit causes low GDP growth basically because of two reasons. Very first, high fiscal deficit reduces investment expenditure by the government on infrastructural expansion in the country. This erodes the inducement to invest. When fiscal deficit is high, rate of taxation also remains high. This reduces disposable income of the people. Means their expenses will be the income which they are keeping for expenses will become low. Consequently, aggregate demand is reduced. Low aggregate demand acts as a serious roadblock in the process of production activity. When people will not demand, why the productivity will increase? When productivity will not increase, income will not increase, because a profit will not increase. Profit not increasing, income will not increase, income will not increase, saving habit will reduce, then what will happen? Definitely low investment will be there. So what is there? Vicious circle of high deficit, fiscal deficit will give low GDP growth, productivity will go down, and the income will also go down. Economic development will again become stagnant. On the other hand, low GDP growth leads to the high fiscal deficit because low GDP generates low revenue for the government, particularly in terms of tax receipt, and low GDP implying that a large segment of the population is between poverty line, raises government expenditure on food subsidy and welfare programs like Manrega for the benefit of below poverty line population. Thus, in case of the situation of high fiscal deficit and low GDP growth persistent a longer period of time, we are almost caught in a vicious circle wherein high fiscal deficit and low GDP growth rate reinforcing each other. Crowding out. What do you mean by crowding out, students? High fiscal deficit leads to crowding out effect. This works like this. High fiscal deficit lead to high borrowings by the government. High borrowings by the government from the money market reduces the availability of funds for private entrepreneurs, private owners. Drought of funds in the market leads to high rate of interest. Drought of funds along with high rate of interest lowers the level of investment in the economy. The economy slips into a state of economic slowdown. Definitely crowding out. What will happen in crowding out, students? In crowding out, this you can see there what will be happening when your fiscal deficit is very high. It will result crowding out effect. What way? Has the income increased? You demanded more. Demand increases the price. When the price increases, people are not able to manage. They will take the loan. They have to pay the rate of interest after taking loan. Their income in the future period of time will not be left that they can do the savings. And their savings, if they cannot do savings, they cannot do investment. And when investment is not there, productivity will go down. The people will come out from that crowding. As they were taking loans, many people were taking loans, they become the habit, that habit will reduce. Because when people were not able to pay off the principal amount and the rate of interest, they will stop borrowing money from the market. Drought of funds in the market leads to high rate of interest. Drought of funds along with high rate of interest lower the level of investment in the economy. That is a factor what I had read. Definitely, when your demand for borrowings will increase, rate of interest in the market will also increase, and when rate of interest of the market increases, people will not be able to pay the money back. So this will reduce the habit of borrowings. Erosion of government credibility. High fiscal deficit and consequently the mounting national debt erodes credibility of the government in the domestic as well as international money market. Credit rating of the government and the economy is lowered. Global investors start withdrawing their investment from domestic economy. Demand for the domestic currency start declining. Exchange rate or starts appreciating. Imports become expensive. Government expenses on import like import of oil in India start picking up. We start importing inflation along with the imports of the goods and services. Domestic investment is eroded. It will stop. The government is left with no options but to open up domestic market for foreign investment. The economy may take a kick start but not without surrendering economic control to the foreigners. Briefly, fiscal deficit must not be allowed to rise unabated. About 3% of GDP is considered to be manageable. High fiscal deficit signals fiscal discipline or lack of fiscal consolidation. It points to a situation when GDP growth is low. Unemployment is high. Revenue yield of the government is low, but its welfare expenses are high. The economic slips into stagnation and revival becomes difficult owing to lack of funds for investment. Primary deficit. When we talk about primary deficit, the deficit which is caused because of the difference between fiscal deficit and revenue interest payment, it is estimated as under. Primary deficit equals to fiscal deficit minus interest payments. While fiscal deficit shows borrowing requirement of the government inclusive of interest payment on the accumulated national debt, primary deficit shows borrowings requirement of the government exclusive of interest payment. In other words, primary deficit indicates government borrowings on account of current year expenditure and current year receipts of the government. Implication we will be going to learn in the next class. Today's class this much only. Next class with some of the calculation and this primary deficit explanation I will complete. Thank you for today's class. Have a nice day.